Hey guys, Lockin here. Today, starting a brand new video series called Know Your Enemy, where we take top tier meta decks, either ones that people are very aware of, ones that people aren't aware of, and we talk about them, break them down. And for those of you who are unaware, my name is Lockin. I'm a Gwent ladder and tournament player, and I'm a part of a team that recently went public called Team Artuza, which is a team of Gwent ladder and tournament players. And in this new video series called Know Your Enemy, I'll occasionally have other people from the team on the show, and I'll be taking inspiration from them. And today, the inspiration is coming from a teammate named Shinmari. He was one of the first ones on the team to discover the deck that we're going to be talking about today, Veteran Skellige. I think Veteran Skellige is actually the second best deck in the game, behind Spies. Shinmari actually was the first one to try it and piloted it to a 1439 faction MMR on the pro ladder, and everyone else on the team who's piloted it has found at least 1300 FMR with it over the course of not very many games. A lot of our guys used it in the qualifier, the recent Gwent qualifier for the Challenger, and all reported good success with it. So far, everyone that we've given the deck to has reported good success with it. It's one of those things that seems bad until you try it, and the inspiration actually came from a deck a while back that Shinmari saw that was a veteran deck, and he took it, changed a lot of the bad cards that focused too much on veterans and required too much setup, and we put in good cards that, had tempo and gave us ways to enable our strategy, and basically just jammed in cards that were overstated and overtuned. So we're going to go and jump right into the deck, and we're going to actually talk about the cards a little out of order. I'm going to talk about the cards that really make this deck what it is, and then we'll talk about all the cards. So the first one is obviously the Clan Tweersock Veteran. This guy's just pure value. He gives you a win condition, but rather than just one win condition, he sort of gives you 5. If you'll notice, the deck plays 3 veterans and 2 skirmishers. The veteran enables you to be constantly playing cards worth 14, 15, 16 plus points in round 3. The strategy is very, very hard to disrupt, and he enables you to find value early, but he also enables you to find value later on. And the next card is kind of the card that really pushed this deck over the top in the most recent patch, and that's Battle Maiden. Battle Maiden gives the deck a lot of consistency in being able to find its veterans, and also gives you a phenomenal restore target so that later on down the line, in, for example, round 3, you can use Restore on Maiden to pull a skirmisher. And the deck really relies on Maiden a lot because the card is, quite frankly, really, really powerful. It reminds me of what Reaver Scout was before it got nerfed. I know it damages by 1, but a lot of the times that's not super relevant. You're going to be restoring it a lot of the times. It's a phenomenal restore target. It's very, very powerful. The next card I want to talk to is Whale Harpooner. This card is just overstated. For a long time, we saw veteran decks that didn't run Harpooner. We tried them, and they felt really, really bad. So Shinmari took the deck, he tried it, he slammed in Harpooners just because they're good, and we tried it, and sure enough, it made the deck better. Harpooner is just a really overstated minion. I think it's really, really powerful. It would be silly to not put it in. So we went ahead and put it in the deck, and sure enough, it's made the deck so much better. You don't even need to run Lacerate, the card's just good on its own. The next card is Restore, and honestly, after the nerf, the card is pretty mediocre in Discard Skellige, but in this deck, it's phenomenal. We have a ton of awesome targets for it to hit. Like I said, we can hit Battle Maiden with it, we can hit Grimmist. A lot of the times, you even can find value on it just using your Restore on Svenrige, just to cycle a dead card in round 3 sometimes. Like, for example, say you thought your Igni was going to find value, Restore into Svenrige. It's not even the end of the world. It's not ideal, but it also enables us. And Wolfsbane is another card that in this recent patch really enabled this deck. The card is crazy good when played with Bran. It's essentially a free card. It gives the deck the tempo it needs to function early on while you're playing your setup of 7, 8, 9, 10. Our deck exponentially gets better with each one. It's very cumulative. It's very much a snowball effect. I think, honestly, Croc is just kind of wrong for the deck because it doesn't enable you to play Wolfsbane. And Wolfsbane is very, very, very powerful. Like I said, it enables the early tempo. It allows you to not just get destroyed by Spies or Woodland Spirit whenever it comes out. It really keeps your deck together and allows you to play this greedier style of deck. And the last one is Decoy, a surprise card that we didn't initially think was going to be super good in the deck, but once we tried it out, obviously knew it was definitely there to stay. It's surprisingly one of the best cards in the whole deck. It's essentially another Sigdrifa because it boosts by 3 and gives another res option. So you're basically playing 2 Sigdrifas in the deck. Sometimes you can even use Decoy on a Battle Maiden to unbrick the hand or to pull more things out of the deck. And then obviously Freya and Sigdrifa are phenomenal targets too. It's pretty rare to ever Decoy onto a Grimmist, but worst case scenario, it's typically at least 10 points off of Grimmist. Now moving on to the list, we'll talk about them in order of rarity and base strength. So up first, not a lot to say about Frey here. Frey's just a good card in these decks. You can res Battle Maidens, you can res Veterans, you can res Skirmishers in round 3. It pairs great with the Decoy. You don't even really mind using one Freya in round 1 for more Veterans just to keep the machine running. It's just a key thing, you don't want to blow them all too early, obviously. The deck is not going to thin down to 0, so if you use 2 in round 1, you may never find another Freya. So using 1, sometimes even 2, depending on what your hand is in round 1, to win round 1 isn't necessarily bad. The card's just really, really good in the deck. The next one is Clan on Crate Raider. This one is pretty straightforward. The deck needs early points. It needs points to feed its strategy, and this is exactly what the Raider does. It's free points, you play it off brand, it's a free 5, and suddenly now you're able to keep up with your opponents more easily. The Skirmisher is your big win condition. It's typically going to be anywhere from 16 to 18 points in round 3. It pairs great with Lugos. It gives you another Battle Maiden target. If your opponent disrupts the Skirmisher, you're not that upset because now you're going to be playing Veterans for 15, 16, and the Skirmisher is great. You want to obviously be resing the Skirmisher if you can. So the Skirmisher is the ideal target, but it's not the only one that we have. The next one is we run 1 Armor Smith, and to be honest, the card is just way too good to not run at least 1. It's very well statted, you pay very little for its effect, it's pretty good at keeping Morkvarg alive too, and the carryover is super important. Moving on to the silvers, Grimmist is the next one. A lot of these decks don't run Grimmist, they want to be trying to slam other things in this slot, whether it's Donar or Udalryk. I don't think that's correct. Grimmist is a really solid backup restore target in a pinch. He's very reliable points, which the deck can use sometimes. The weather clear is very convenient. It's not super relevant in this meta, but it is very, very nice. The Grimmist is sort of like a win condition in itself against Eredin. Just drawing Grimmist and having a restore in hand on Grimmist is quite often just enough to beat Eredin on its own. You can really use Grimmist whenever you just need points, or a weather clear. He's very versatile. I think he's a very, very good card, and I think he's actually more important than a lot of people give him credit for. The next one is Sigdrifa. Obviously, this card is really good. There's not a lot to say. It enables a lot of what you're doing. It's just a better Freya. It's obviously best in round 3, so you want to be saving it over your Freyas. There's not a lot to say on it. Up next is Svenrige. Surprisingly, this is the silver that you would be most likely to cut. And I know that sounds really, really weird with the veteran tag and everything else that he offers. You don't need him. He's very nice, but he's not necessary to the deck. If you were going to cut any silver from the deck, it would probably be Svenrige. He's really good, but he's still got some just problems sometimes. The upsides are obviously very high. He can smooth out your hand if you have a bricked hand. He gives you the option of saving 1 mulligan slot if you get 1 bad off of Bran. He's quite good for obvious reasons. He's a free 14 points in round 3 most of the time, 13 or 12 in round 2. Obviously he's really good. I do think he's the 6th best silver slot. If you were going to cut a card, it would probably be Svenrige, but that being said, we do think he's the best one for this slot. And then we have Morkvarg, and Morkvarg is pretty straightforward. Carryover is still really, really good. It enables you to pass at certain points a card up to avoid your opponent's dry passing you later on because of the carryover. Obviously, you're going to be playing it off of Bran. It's the same tempo as a Raider. You play it for the same reasons you play Raider for the 5 points, but you then also get the carryover. And that's sort of the thing. There's no reason to play another Raider when you can be playing Morkvarg. Morkvarg is just really good in the slot. If it's another silver, and he's really, really good, and he's free. Looking at the golds, the first one to talk about is Geralt Digny. This one, we tried a lot of tech choices here, and eventually someone just said, why don't we just run Igni? And we tried it, and it was really good. Few people play around it as much as they should, and even the best players on the ladder can't dodge Gigni because of our Harpooner setup. Gigni is phenomenal in long rounds where you need points. He's very consistent very often. If you find a time where you can't play Igni, you can just mulligan him away because after round 1, your mulligans get pretty easy. Up next is Coral. This is just one of the best golds in the game in my opinion. It shuts down Nilfgaard really well, whether that's killing Iris or a Wokim target. It shuts down Ronvid and Trollolol. It shuts down Quint Dragoons and Protectors. It shuts down Farseers. It just shuts down the opponent's strategy, and gives you a 5 body as well. It's really, really powerful. It's very, very good. You'd be stupid not to run it in a Skellige deck. It just really, really lets you do your thing of play a lot of just big stat units and shut down your opponent's statted units. Very, very powerful. Up next is Lugos. In normal Skellige, Lugos is just kind of a bad muzzle. He's pretty much pointless to play past the discard aspect. Discarding things just for the sake of discarding them isn't really a thing anymore since Captains got nerfed a while back. But in this deck, Lugos is not just an 8 or a 9 point hit like a Yorvith, basically. He's a 6-point gold that usually hits something for 14, sometimes even more, and it puts whatever it hits in the graveyard for you to res, and that res is often 17 or 16 or 18, and it enables a Battle Maiden that you restored early on the other skirmisher still in the deck for this huge tempo play. It's an awesome card with this kind of deck, and it really, really, really gives you a lot of round 3 punch. Really, really powerful. He can be used in round 1 if you need points or if you really need a veteran or something, but for the most part we look to Lugos round 3 to get rid of a skirmisher. And finally, looking at the leader is Bran. Bran's just insane. He's got an insane leader ability. He has veteran synergy. He just does so much for the deck. There are some matchups where Nilfgaard, for example, you can play a veteran before Bran to get Bran to 3, so he's harder to kill, because a lot of times Bran is worth 5, 6, occasionally even 7 points in round 1, depending on how much you use. Bran is really, really good with the deck, just because he has the veteran tag, but not only just that, but because he gives you so much consistency and tempo for free. Just all the time. Like, it's just, he's too good not to run. I just don't think that there's any reason to not be playing Bran if you're playing Skellige. Looking at the next part, we'll talk about the tech choices, just some whys and why nots. We've been running this deck, kind of in secret for a good 2-3 weeks at this point. So we've experimented with a lot of things. A lot of guys have teched things that they like or don't like. Basically, here's some of the viable tech choices we've come upon, some explanations for why some of the other cards aren't as good. The first one is Donar. Perfectly acceptable. He's an acceptable 6 silver slot. You can play him instead of Fenriga. They do very different things, but they're both very powerful. Donar in this meta, a lock is very valuable. The ability to move stuff back to your graveyard is actually pretty good. It can win you games in the mirror, for example. I do think he's pretty good. That being said, we do personally like Svenrige more than Donar, but he's a perfectly viable tech choice if you really, really need locks. Up next is Udalryk. This is another acceptable tech choice. We played around with Udalryk a little bit. A lot of the times, the problem that Udalryk has is he sort of does the same thing that Svenrige does with, thinning your deck out, except he gains you card advantage. The problem being, it's at the cost of points, and a lot of the times, you can't afford those points. You really need them. And Svenrige is the same thinning, but he gives you the points. Obviously, you don't get the card, so it's not the same, but we really don't feel that the deck struggles enough to need a spy. We really feel that the deck values the points of Svenrige far more. Another problem in the deck is, while yes, a silver spy is very rarely bad to have, all of our cards in our deck we actually want. We are very afraid of a time where we play Udalryk and we get offered Decoy Sigdrifa. Those are very bad situations, or Coral Freya. We want all of our cards. We don't benefit off of playing a Freya from the graveyard other than just the 1 point it gives us. So Udalryk doesn't really do anything for our deck discard wise, and it feels very bad to discard key cards. That's why we didn't really feel Udalryk was correct. There are matchups where Udalryk is obviously better than not, but we don't feel that Udalryk is the correct choice, though he is still a barely viable one. You would cut Svenrige for this one. Another one is Summoning Circle. This is like an Udalryk, except or just a spy, but with a little bit more upside, with higher ups and lower lows. And oftentimes you just spy your opponent back, or you just steal something good that they played. The card is rarely ever just bad. The question just often comes down to, do I want to play a card where I don't know what I'm going to get? I may get something of my opponents that I really want, or would I rather play something in my own deck of my own silvers that I know I can have? And that's sort of what it came down to. We sort of decided if we were going to play a 6 silver side, we were going to tech, we wanted it to be Svenrige or Donar. We felt that Summoning Circle was close, but it wasn't quite what we were looking for. We didn't feel like it really felt the theme of the deck, and we felt the deck had enough power to sort of push its own strategy rather than really worry about the opponents. The final tech option is Olgierd versus Morkvarg. They accomplish very similar things. If you own one but not the other, feel free to swap them out. They do most of the same thing. There's not a lot to say here. Let's talk about bad tech options. Bjorna Brand is one that comes to mind. I think this card is a trap. She says veteran, so people jam her in the deck, but I think it's pretty bad. Typically, the longest round in the game a lot of the times is round 1, when your opponent really wants to win, or you're trying to bleed like a Frost deck, for example, out of cards. So, except in mirrors and certain matchups, you more often than not want to be playing Bjorna round 1. So her veteran tag isn't quite as powerful as it may seem at first. Another thing is a lot of decks run single weather clears. They happen to run one, this Silver Mage, where they run like one random Griffin or one random Bearer. The problem is we don't have anything to follow up Bjorna. We play Bjorna for 4 or 5 points when she's played, and then Skellige Storm hits, and they play their Silver Spy, and they clear it, and that is exactly what they want. In fact, they've actually buffed their units. Skellige Storm now actually buffs your opponent's cards if they clear right away with the recent buff to Clear Skies. Let's say a bad Gigni might only hit for 15 points. Storm would need to be on the board unanswered, hitting 3 units for 4 turns for it to be as good as a bad Igni. And when she's played, she's very low tempo compared to Igni. I think Gigni has way more potential upside than an ideal Bjorna, and I think Bjorna is sadly a trap. I think let the Bjorna meme die. I think Gigni is just way better for what the deck does. Up next is Muzzle. I think Muzzle looks great, and I think it would be a great card to run. But we have to ask ourselves, what are we cutting? Wolfsbane is literally one of the reasons the deck even functions at all, so I think it's completely wrong to cut Wolfsbane. Lugos is 20 points, and Thinning, don't want to cut that, enables our Skirmisher Battle Maiden. Obviously we don't want to cut that. We want to cut Coral, one of the best golds in the game, phenomenal gold card. Don't want to cut that. Okay, well now what are we cutting? We're looking at cutting these cards that do so much for our deck, and it feels wrong. That's sort of the problem with the muzzle, is the muzzle could be great, and yeah, it feels really bad when someone muzzles away our Morkvarg, but that just happens and we have to accept it, and those games are still perfectly winnable. It feels like muzzle would make the deck worse overall, and I think muzzle's incorrect. A couple card synergies to go over is obviously in round 3, something like an ideal round 3 would be a Lugos onto a Skirmisher to then resurrect that Skirmisher, then to restore a Battle Maiden on the Skirmisher, and that's going to give you 60 points. Or a Veteran plus a Maiden in round 1, or a Maiden onto a Harpooner in round 1 just to get the Maiden dead for a future restore and to get the deck thinned down. You're playing lots and lots of points with potential upside as well. Harpooner Igni, another good example. Decoy instead of using a different res sometimes if you're afraid your opponent's going to kill Sigdrifa in the final round. Sometimes you have to say, okay, I could hold on to this decoy, but if my opponent kills my Sigdrifa, my decoy is dead. So sometimes you have to say, all right, I'll decoy this Freya and then and save this Freya for later. That way, at least my decoy might not be dead round 3. These are just things and combos you have to keep in mind. Moving on to the mulligan, if your hand has at least 1 to-do veterans, try to blacklist at least 1 skirmisher so you don't have to worry about it. You don't want that in the opening hand. And then in order of necessity, you want to blacklist Wolfsbane, Raider, and Morkvarg. And then you want to look to clear your hand of 3-ofs of Harpooner and Freya and that nonsense, even Veteran too. We really want to be pulling our cards with Battle Maiden to thin the deck and to get it dead. If your hand is decent, you don't have any brand targets in hand, give yourself ideally at max 3 reses in your hand between Freya's, Restore, and Sigdrifa. Obviously be very, very careful. If you've not drawn any pieces of the brand discard combo in your hand by the end of your second mulligan, I would just sit on your hand. The only time that's ever incorrect is if you have no veterans. Obviously, you need to be mulliganing aggressively if you don't have any veterans, as it's the lifeblood of your deck. But be very, very careful if you have 1 or 2 veterans. Be very, very careful of just bricking yourself with drawing into a Wolfsbane, trying to mulligan aggressively when you don't need to. In my experience, a hand without a veteran is actually worse than a hand with Raider or Morkvarg in it. Looking to matchups now as the final one. Spies. This is actually the deck's trickiest matchup if you lose coin flip. Though interestingly enough, that can actually be said for any deck in the game right now. Spies is very, very powerful. So a very key part of this matchup is to aggressively protect Morkvarg with Armorsmith, and ideally try to force out at least 3 engines before you pass with a card up and carryover. If you can't protect your carryover, this game is going to be much, much harder. If you don't have carryover, your opponent can very easily dry pass on you. You need to check typically at least 2 of the 3 boxes against spies. You need to at least force out 3 engines. You need to have carryover, and you need to be a card up. If you can't at least check 2 of the 3 boxes, spies will likely steamroll you. It's a very, very powerful deck, and very good players will steam your roll with the deck. If you don't get the 3 engines out before round 3, they'll beat you easily in a long round. That being said, you can beat them in a 7 or 8 card round if you get enforcers out or you get a couple brigades out, because you're playing such well statted minions. Another thing to remember too is Vico Medic is a big problem. Don't go all in on a skirmisher, rezzing it 2 or 3 times to get it to 21, 23, 24. The medics will steal it. Minnow will kill it. It's very important that you diversify your numbers so that even if they medic a skirmisher from you, you're still playing a veteran for 15. You're still playing a veteran for 14. And I know it may feel bad when they steal your skirmisher, but oftentimes an emissary is worth 16, 18 points a lot of the times. So they're not really gaining that much more. They're just sort of shutting you down, but they're only shutting you down by about 1 or 2 points. Something also to remember is you can res your Lockin in the matchup with Sigdrifa. Just be careful. Always weigh what's in your deck versus just rezzing a skirmisher. Don't outplay yourself here. A skirmisher is worth 16, 17 points. Sometimes it's better to just res a skirmisher than it is to, res Lockin. Another thing is to try and put yourself in positions where you can Coral Iris. These are very important things to do in the matchup. Looking to Arid and Frost, this is honestly a pretty favored matchup. You want to mulligan aggressively for Grimmist and Armorsmith. Look to Grimmist after they commit 2 rows of weather roughly. A good player is never going to commit 3 rows of weather for you to clear, so just take the 2 rows of weather and clear them. If they kill your Grimmist, you can always restore him again for more clear skies. You can decoy him, you can Sigdriva him. We run so many ways to play Grimmist. As long as we're smart and play around their roughly 5 total weathers, the matchup is very, very favored. Another thing is to play on the Frost. It bricks their Drowners, makes them unable to play more Frost from the Hound, and Lacerate and Frost have anti-synergy, so most Eridans can't justify running it. Harpooners shut down Riders. We move them away from the Frost, and then we Coral Iris whenever they try to play her. This matchup is very, very favored. Be willing to mulligan aggressively to find Grimmist, and you're likely in a very powerful position. Against machines, this one is very important. Try and stick round 1 as long as possible. If you go to round 3 on at least even, you're almost 100% to win. If you can have Lugos for Bork and just one-shot it, I would say 100% to win the game. Try and Coral Ronvid. If it's their biggest unit, it shuts down their carryover and reliable crewmen. If you can't Coral Ronvid, then try to save Coral for like a siege support that they res with Shani. Things like this, things that you can't interact with easily. Try to make sure the Coral is always accomplishing something big in the matchup. Shutting them down, mostly their crewmen down, is one of the biggest ways to beat them. And even if you can't win round 1, very, very, very aggressively hang on to the round. Try to keep Armorsmith to shut down their ballista. It'll find a lot of value. Don't overgreed with the Armorsmith. Sometimes people will keep their Armorsmith 1 extra turn to get a couple more points. Suddenly they hinsled out a bunch of ballistas, a lot of things die, and they've missed a chance to heal and gain the armor. Up next is Spell Squirtle and Buff Squirtle. Try and take advantage of their slow tempo by setting up your game plan and pulling ahead early. Once they commit 2 of their 3 engines, a lot of times you can just pass. If they try to go all in on tempo to keep up with you, then that's fine. They're missing a lot of value. Just match their tempo. Just stick with them. Play the Wolfsbane. Play, Harpooners and Veterans, and be very, very aggressive keeping up with them. If you can win on even to bleed them out of important cards. If you can't win, then go into try to bleed them out of engines and then pass as soon as they play the second one. They've only got so much. They've only got so many Dragoons, so many Farseers. And against Swim's new Spellitel, just play to win round 1. The deck is very easily bled out. Coral finds even more value than usual in this matchup because a lot of times she's hitting a card that's at 30 strength, 34 strength. The matchup is even more favored than traditional Spellitel because their setup has less payout. Something to note though is against Swim Spellitel, there's no engines to bleed out. If you pass too early, they will beat you. So you have to really try to push the round 1 against them, and then you can very easily bleed them out because the deck has only 2 or 3 win conditions really. Traditional discard is probably the toughest matchup, but it's still not bad. They have more carryover, and when they muzzle your Morkvarg, you're sad. But if you're going second, try and win round 1 on even so you can bleed Saris out of them round 2 and let your points do the work round 3. If you're going first, your best bet is to lose round 1 a card up. ideally so that you can somewhat nullify their carryover. The downside is if you don't get Ceres out of them round 1 and haven't killed Morkvarg at least once by this point, you're likely going to lose the game. Coral is incredibly key in this matchup. You need to snipe a carryover tool, whether that's Ekimara or a 9-strength Olgierd or a 9-strength Morkvarg they had to play from hand, or even just a 5-strength Morkvarg early. The key to this matchup is navigating around Ceres. If you lose the coin flip, this is very, very difficult. This matchup is usually borderline unwinnable against a top tier SK player. That being said, if you can manage to navigate around Ceres, really bleed them of the reses, force her out in key rounds, you may still be able to win. Up next is the Radovid Northern Realms deck. The deck's finisher is really powerful, sometimes even more so than yours. Using Coral on Ronvid or Trollolol, depending on which variant it is very, very important. You need to shut that down for a lot of reasons. Ronvid is carryover and accruement. Trollolol is a phenomenal Shani target. I would argue that on this deck, you need to win round 1 on even cards and often look to force a Dijkstra and Shani out of them in round 2. If they go to round 3 with 3 or 4 cards and they have Shani and Dijkstra, you are unlikely to win that match in my opinion. Oftentimes, even with your points, you will struggle to find a way to overcome Shani plus Dijkstra plus all these finishers. You really, really need to try to bleed them out or take them into a long round 1 with a lot of tempo where they have to use something like Shani or Dijkstra to keep up. Lastly, Consume. I wasn't actually initially going to put this in as I don't think Consume is a very good deck. I think it's very weak, very easily disruptible. That being said, it's very, very good against Veterans. Veterans doesn't really possess a lot of ways to deal with the Necker spam, so oftentimes the Consume will just very quickly steamroll them. It's very important you very much want to Coral the first Necker that they play in the hopes that they don't have a second one. Sometimes they don't. So you use Coral quickly, and then from there, they're forced to play very slowly. They've already played one 3-strength card. Let's say you Coral it. Now they play another 3-strength card. Well, now you try to tempo them out and you play a lot of points. You jam Morkvarg and a Raider and Wolfsbane, and suddenly you're up by so much you pass. And suddenly, if they want to get value out of their Necker, they have to go 2, 3, 4 cards down a lot of the time. So really don't be afraid to tempo them out. This is a very tricky matchup. Lastly, let's talk about the deck itself. This is probably what a lot of people are here to see. What actually is the secret to beating this deck? One of the biggest things is the deck feels really bad when Morkvarg is muzzled or killed early. Having the carryover shut down makes the deck a lot harder to pilot because it means if you lose on even and your opponent dry passes you, you have to go a card down, and Morkvarg is a great way at stopping that from happening. The deck can still win a card down sometimes just due to raw round 3 power, so don't always feel that that's going to be enough, but it is a great starting point. It's important also to try to bleed the deck of key cards in round 2, I feel. That being said, the deck has a lot of key cards. Only do this option if you really feel you're able to push very powerfully round 2 and have a lethal round 3 like an Inar or a Nilfgaard. If you're playing a deck with a high long round capability, Machine, Spies, you will destroy them in a long round. The deck's staying potential is rather high and it does have a lot of points, but eventually the points slowly fade off. It starts high and slowly tapers down, so don't be afraid to push them in for a long round 3 if you can manage to tempo them out early. Veteran SK also doesn't have a lot of ways to interact with the opponent, so decks like Necker Spam can heavily outpower the deck if you have your tools. It can just very easily overrun it. I think another problem with the deck too is people want to say Graveyard Hate would stop it. That's just not true, unfortunately. Veterans are worth 13, 14, 15, so yes, you steal a Skirmisher that was worth 17. Now they play Veterans that are worth 14 and 15. You're not really stopping them. Another good way to try to stop the deck outside of that is a lot of times people will keep Decoy for round 3, and if you suspect your opponent may have a Decoy in hand, one of the best ways to shut them down is actually, instead of taking like a full 6 or 7 point ping value onto something like a Skirmisher, you instead sink that 6 or 7 into Sigdrifa or the Freya if it's the only one that they have. If they have a lone Sigdrifa or Freya, you sink the points into it, and now suddenly they are losing the ability to decoy, and their decoy is dead, and they have a dead card of worth only 3 points. If you choose to leave that alive and you have the ability to kill it, you are effectively giving them a decoy that is at minimum worth 16 points. So I think it's very, very important that if they have a lone target there, try to kill it off. Try to make them have that decoy and just make them brick it. The deck isn't really easily disrupted, so there's not a lot of easy to explain counters. The deck isn't really simply stopped by things like Vico Varomedic, and It has a lot of medium to short round potential, and it can really stick with you in long rounds in round 1, so it's very, very hard to tempo out. Funny enough, its biggest weakness is the coin flip and carryover that it can't keep up with. So for that reason, decks that also abuse the coin flip are quite good against it. Spies, other discard SK. I think when piloted correctly in round 1, the deck becomes rather straightforward in later rounds. If you can manage to navigate round 1, rounds 2 and 3 become very simple, and eventually it'll just steamroll your opponent with raw numbers. I think the deck is incredibly underrated, and as time goes on and on, I think we'll see more and more of this deck. I don't think it's like worth a nerf or anything like that. I do think it is the second best deck in the game. I think if this deck goes untouched and Spies does get this expected nerf at the mid-season point, we could see Veteran become the best deck in the game. Very surprisingly, very much out of nowhere. I think the deck is incredibly underrated, and I hope that this video may draw a little bit more attention to what I think is a very, very powerful deck. If anyone is interested in seeing the deck played, Shinmari will be playing the deck on his Twitch in the coming days. If you're interested in seeing other styles of gameplay, I will also be streaming this deck and others as well on my channel, so feel free to tune into that. If there's a deck you'd like to see me do in the future, let me know on Twitter or in the comments, and if you have any suggestions, feel free to leave them. This is just the beginning of a Know Your Enemy series that I'll be doing. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you guys in the next video.